implement, got it, create and implement story boxes, experience books, and what I call authentic choice-making opportunities. And I regard these three activities as literacy lessons. Our focus for today is going to be on learners with complex communication needs, which would include those with extensive support needs, children who are deaf-blind, and especially we're thinking about kids who are deaf with additional disabilities, or with disability, I should say, excuse me, and also children who are pre-linguistic. So what is literacy? When we think of traditional literacy, we think of being able to read and write, reading in print, reading through auditory methods, writing in print, writing in Braille, and so on. And we think of traditional literacy as being achieved after one is linguistic or has developed language. But we all know that we have many receptive experiences with literacy and hope with traditional literacy, and hopefully interactive experiences with traditional literacy long before we are linguistic ourselves. Literacy lessons for all of us, and especially for this group of learners, is an important context for communication to occur. And so we say we need an expanded view of literacy, that traditional literacy is completely inadequate because it doesn't respect the participation and engagement of learners who are pre-linguistic. So we have an expanded view. Some people use the term emergent literacy to describe the stage of literacy that all of us experience from birth until we achieve traditional literacy of reading and writing in traditional ways. So on this page, I kind of smile at you because I just sort of call these classic emergent literacy lessons. One of the joys of getting older is you can get away with stuff like that, right? So I've dubbed them classic literacy lessons. And when I teach at Boston College, the way I define that is these are critical lessons that every teacher needs to know how to implement well. And they are the daily schedule, sometimes called the calendar system, read alouds, which is when we read to a child, shared reading, which means, yes, we're reading to the child, but it's more than that. There's an interaction, there's more turn taking going on. And that can, of course, be across communication forms. Story boxes, which we'll talk about today. Experience stories, also known as experience books, which we'll talk about today. Journals, and I especially like interactive journals for this population. And authentic choice making, which we'll also talk about today. I see a few more people that I'm admitting. So what are our goals then when we think about lessons for learners who are at the stage of emergent literacy, which is a stage that we all go through and for quite an extended period of time? One important idea is that we're building our relationships over the literacy activities that we share with them. And there are more people being admitted, just so you know. Right, whoops, let me go back. We are also in that relationship then sharing attention with them and attention over literacy materials, which is intersubjective joint attention. We are sharing positive affect. We are expanding communication skills. So sometimes we think of communication and then literacy because we're stuck in that thought about traditional literacy. But communication is across the whole spectrum of literacy skills. What we sometimes forget is that we actually utilize literacy lessons or activities to teach communication skills. So it's really woven throughout. And some of the skills we work on would be key vocabulary across communication forms, which could be using objects, textures, signs, photos, line drawings. We teach them the meaning of specific representations, which may be iconic or they may be symbols. And we work on turn-taking skills. We also, in the context of emergent literacy lessons, work on literacy skills like the main idea, characters, sequence, and so on. And we provide reading and writing experiences to pre-linguistic learners. And I'll touch base on that through an example later. We also build book handling skills, and that would be especially important for the children who are blind or visually impaired and or deafblind. And we work hard to create active roles for the child, which actually supports them in developing some of the components of self-determination. The next idea I'd like to talk with you about before we get into the lessons is literacy-rich environments. So when we think of that phrase, we always think about the materials, right? And it's important that those materials are meaningful to the learners who will use them. And it's really nice if the individual who's deaf with a disability or deafblind or has multiple disabilities could have an area in the classroom and the home with some literacy materials that they can access independently. So they'll have some activities with a more knowledgeable other, a parent, a teacher, a peer that's a little bit older maybe. And then they'll have other experiences that are shifted then into an independent reading area, because that's something that almost all children have, and they should have that experience also. And some people call that a literacy center, perhaps. And that's important because we want them to take the initiative, and we want them to be able to let us know that they have an interest in something, as opposed to always responding or participating in a literacy lesson like a book that we've chosen from the ones that are at more of an instructional level. So a literacy-rich environment isn't just about the materials, it's about the kind of opportunities we create. And I've been doing some writing, a lot of writing this summer, and it's always good to remind ourselves, no matter how experienced we are, that children with complex communication needs may also have difficulties with ambulation, making it difficult to get to that independent reading area. Some of them have health challenges. They often have extensive related service professional involvement, meaning OT, PT, and so forth. So their days are so full that they actually have far fewer experiences to engage in literacy than hearing and sighted children have. And it's just the opposite of what they need. So I was just talking to a team yesterday that I've been working with this past year and said, we've got to have at least 2 experiences every day in the summer program for reading and writing. We must do that, as well as concept development lessons and all of the other things that are part of the child's day. So it's good to remember that the kids who need the most sometimes are getting the least in terms of opportunities. And that causes a delay in their literacy development that really has nothing to do with them. So another idea is the importance of experiences. And I think right away of the kids who are deaf, the kids who are blind, the kids who are deafblind. And I think about how our distance senses play a role in the quality, the way that we experience something. So it's important to think about the reduction in observational learning and incidental learning that happens for this population. So let's pause on that idea for a moment. Sometimes people use these terms interchangeably, but they are not synonymous. Observational learning could be learning through observation visually or auditorily. And it could be that you're doing it with tremendous intention. you're watching very closely because you want to learn how to put together something that you're assembling, for example. But sometimes we learn through observation without any special effort. We just sort of maybe by accident pick up some information. Maybe we overhear our parents and we learn something that maybe we shouldn't be learning, right? So incidental learning, in contrast, is when we pick up on something, we learn something without any special intention. Children who are deafblind have very few opportunities to learn through observation, and very little incidental learning occurs. And that is true also of many children who are deaf or hard of hearing with disabilities, and children with complex communication needs who have vision or hearing loss. So we want to be cognizant of the important role families and schools play in building a rich repertoire of repeated experiences to ground concept development, which is then connected to the acquisition of meaningful vocabulary. Let me take a sip and let our poor interpreter catch up a little bit and catch his breath.
Susan, while you're doing that, there's been a request if you're willing to share the slides or not. That way people are determining how to take notes. So I wanted to ask.
Oh, I thought I was already.
Oh, no, I need to share the slides afterwards to email them out.
Oh, okay. Oh, you scared me. Are you able to still see the PowerPoint?
Not now, it just got closed out, but we were up until this point.
Oh, shoot, I'm gonna have to start all over. Hold on. I misunderstood your meaning and then I closed it out. So
Oh, no.
Again, yeah.
There was just some people were interested in getting the slides afterwards for their own reference. So
yeah, I understand.
Oh.
Yes, of course, that would be fine.
Okay, thank you.
So let me just go ahead and do another share screen.
Dr. McCown, Animal Hospital.
Sounds like we have somebody that needs to mute perhaps. All right, are you able to see that now? It looks like you can on my screen.
Yes, you're good. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Let me just move some things around here. Get back to slow to the show slide. And let me catch up here. All right, so experiences are very, very important, and we're responsible to provide those. All right, this is something, this next slide, about individualizing and personalizing literacy. I've been really big on this since, I guess, maybe 2015. In our fields, we tended to use these terms synonymously, and like the two previous terms, these are not synonymous. Individualizing means that we're thinking about all of the modifications of the curriculum, all of the accommodations, assistive technologies, including adaptive equipment that we might need for positioning and so forth, all the kinds of things we articulate on the Individualized Education Plan, or the IEP. All right, and it's very important. Everything should be individualized for our students. The second idea is personalizing. Personalizing literacy lessons mean that these lessons are about the child's lived or actual experiences, not vicarious, because they don't have a lot of those. So they're actual lived experiences. I love this concept when I was reading in the early literacy chapter. And I can recall when my grown children were little and they enjoyed seeing their name in a book. You know how you can order commercially produced books with their names in it. And they like to have stories and memories shared about things that they did. But the importance of this for the population we're devoted to is much greater. The importance of this lies in the idea that for children who are deaf with disability, children who are blind with multiple disabilities, and so on, they have fewer opportunities to share memories of what happened to them. Think about how often our vision and hearing help us to remember something. It's very plausible that often what we think is a true memory is there with us because we saw it in reviewing videotapes and photographs and so forth. So vision and hearing play a really strong role in the development of these shared memories. So that's one reason. And also because of the reduction in observational and incidental learning, it's important to personalize. So memory, acquisition of literacy skills, pure enjoyment, and I'll connect to this idea of personalized literacy when I get into the experience books and make that kind of come alive for you. It's really, really critical though, and also a lot of fun. Also, just this last year, a couple of the divisions, including ours and the DVI-DB division, participated in a special issue on culturally sustaining practices for teaching exceptional children journal. And while we were working, I learned so much from working with colleagues on that. It pushed me to thinking in a deeper level. I think we all had that feeling. And one of my realizations was that personalized literacy about someone's lived experiences is extremely powerful as a practice that is culturally sustaining or asset grounded or asset based. And that's because we can use representations, we can use a storyline that reflects the heritage and the activities and values of the family. So that's another benefit that we're really just starting to think about when we consider story boxes, experience books, and other forms then of personalized literacy. So when we're thinking about making books or making story boxes that are about a real experience, because sometimes story boxes are done for commercially produced books, and I'll show you an example in a little bit, but sometimes they're just a collection of things that are from an activity we did with a child, like maybe going to a birthday party and taking pieces of things that happened from the party. So one important concept then is saliency. And that means, I tend to think of this in terms of blindness or deaf blindness, but I think it has relevance to all the learners that we're serving. We define as hearing and sighted people an experience in a particular way. And then as individuals, we also define it, right? The children will define an experience in a way that might be quite a bit different. So we want to attend to what they feel, what they find to be most important about an experience, what stands out to them, what drew an emotional reaction. And actually we remember things that are highly emotional best of all. What held their attention? What did they spend their time with? In other words, how did they define it? Not how did I define it if I was the partner in that exploration. It's essential. So I might go to the zoo and the most salient thing might be seeing an animal that I've been trying to catch, and it's been out for different reasons, like thinking about the National Zoo and going there 3 times trying to see the panda bears and never succeeding. If I went a 4th time and the pandas were there, that would be the most salient thing for me about that trip. But the most salient thing for a child who's blind with multiple disabilities or deafblind might be completely different. It could have been being close to a fence and having a petting zoo animal lick their hand, perhaps. So we have to watch and be students of our learners. All right. So we can collect these objects then that can be used with books, and we can collect them to retell a shared experience like a birthday party or a trip to the park. And it's best if if the experience is repeated and if the objects are collected with the child. So this is all about the concept of saliency then. So let's talk story boxes, which I've drifted into a little bit already. Story boxes, as I said, can be a collection of objects that you have created based on an actual experience. Most often we tend to save that for experience books though. Oftentimes story boxes are used as a collection of objects to go with a commercially produced book. These objects can be a substitution for illustrations that might not be seen by the child, although we could certainly use a magnifying device to help with some of that. But sometimes the visual clutter is still way too much. Or because perhaps the child has difficulty cognitively interpreting the meaning of illustrations. So we need something more concrete. We need the objects. The objects support engagement. They support comprehension of the book, and they can support oral retelling. So that could be in any form of communication, not really oral literally, of an experience. So this picture is one of The Hungry Caterpillar. It's a book for which a number of people have developed story boxes or storyboards for, I sometimes call those sequence boards. Of course, we'd have to wonder about the fruit, and are we using real fruit or plastic fruit, and how that kind of changes the experience and so on. So you'd have to think about this for the child, but there are commercially produced story box materials, or you can make your own. Here's another one. This one's done on Goodnight Moon, and you can see some of the American Printing House for the Blind materials that they've used with the story. So these are commercially produced books. This next one is a commercially produced book, as you can see, that was adapted for a child who's deaf-blind, who has a severe hearing loss, and also also legally blind, but has functional vision and some functional hearing, as I said. So this is Under My Hood, I Have a Hat. This particular child isn't really bothered too much by glare. So those of you that might be in the field of blindness will notice some glare on these pages. And this teacher would have had to been concerned about that for another child, but not so much for this particular child. And so she's added on this next page a tactile element then, well, a couple of them. She's got the facial features in raised lines for the child to touch. She's got the cape in felt and the buttons and the tie on the cape, all to add interest for the child. So this is actually an example of more of an experience book, really. Excuse me, not an experience book. It's a story book, and it has a story box of materials. And then she's also adapted the commercially produced story, excuse me. She's also made the text appear on a separate page to focus on the text and sign it with the child. And then this is how she organizes things. So for every story box, she has a blue bin. Red bins, and I love this for kids with multiple disabilities. Red always means all done or finished, whichever term you're using. So you don't mix red bins with anything else. And then you can have a red bin for when the materials are done. You can have when they're done with the materials, you'll have a red bin at the end of the schedule system, because that also means all done. This particular teacher also had another red bin that was a little more shallow. And during morning meeting, as each of the children handled different materials, they placed it in that red bin. But the idea is red means all done, whether it's an activity or specifically a literacy activity. And so these are all books, story boxes that she works on in literacy lessons directly with a particular child. Actually, they have multiple shelving systems in this large classroom. And then here you see another view, and in the foreground, you can see the setup of the daily schedule, which is an object schedule at this time. And you see the edge that's red. Earlier on, she had to use a red bin, but now having an edge of red is fine because the child associates red with all done. So a lot of times we think deeply about how to create a story box. And I've just spoken with you about maybe a storage option, but we need to think about implementing it. And the thing I find tricky is how much time and when to handle the objects versus the story itself, the book. Let's think of it as a commercially produced book. So sometimes the book, the storyline of the book gets so interrupted by objects that I wonder how that changes this literacy experience. So here's just one suggestion for an instructional protocol. And this is based on doing dozens and dozens of these with multiple teams, and actually just working with the team yesterday on this. So I might say something like, this is an example, this particular one, of a story box that corresponds to an action or an experience rather than a book. So I have two protocols. So this first one, I might call up the memory and say, remember, and then whatever it is, or like remember cooking, whatever the experience might be. And I might have this box then, or bin, with objects or pictures with a label. And I would allow time for the learner to pull out those objects. I might provide a board or a slant board and even work with them to sequence the objects to match the experience they had. We might talk about what they preferred, their likes and their dislikes, thinking about the power of emotion to memory. We might even do some motor reenactments, because those are the very first forms of intentional communication. So if the child was jumping the day before, then we might do some jumping and talk about that relevant to a memory. And then when we're done exploring and having an interaction across communication forms, the child would be supported to put these objects then in an all done or finished bin. We might also do some kind of drawing if the child enjoyed drawing about an experience as a form of writing. Now, moving on and thinking about how we might implement a story box that corresponds to a book, and let's say it's a commercial book, we would introduce the title of the book and show the book to the learner. We would then, this is the time, to have the child explore the different related objects in the story box that you have collected that correspond to the story. And we would name, we can voice, we can sign each of the objects. If the child is visual, we might even pair some of them with pictures or photographs. And then we will have to make a decision based on what we know about that child's attention around where to put those objects. It would be nice if it's possible for them to still be physically accessible to the child, in case the child might want to make a comment through an object while you read. You would then read the book and offer perhaps some opportunities to handle a few of the objects and relate them to the book, but maybe not going so overboard that we lose the storyline. So you have to get a mix of that. And I think that's about your individual expertise with each child. But oftentimes I do get concerned because I see so much handling of objects, the story just isn't there anymore. So you need a blend of both. And then, similar to when it's based on a lived experience, the child would place these objects in the all done or finished bin, whichever term you're using. And as you're doing that with the child, or the child's doing it, you will again voice, sign if appropriate, the name of the objects again. This next one is really a variation on a story box. So in this picture, we see a sequence set up. So again, it's on the hungry caterpillar, so that you can distinguish two different approaches. In this one, they've created a sequence of the foods that the caterpillar ate in the book. And they placed them on a board that has a black background to optimize vision use. And they put them in a sequence that they appear in the book, so that the child gets a sense of sequence in literacy, and also left to right. And it's interesting that they have paired the actual objects with line drawings that are colored in. So it could be that this particular child is working on transitioning from understanding objects to understanding pictures, which would be a bit more abstract then. Okay, and when you're doing a sequence board, I think that's something you might be able to connect to what's going on in the inclusive classroom. So just yesterday, we were doing a little troubleshooting about where we're going with including a second grader who's deafblind and pre-linguistic, but boy, very close to understanding symbols. It's emerging. And I'm thinking about how often in elementary school, they do talk about sequence. And often general educators do a first, second, third, or first, then kind of board. And we can relate that to the children we serve, perhaps through objects, photographs, or so on, whatever is most suitable for the child. Whether you're working with children who are blind or children who have complex communication needs and typical vision, I think you might find the Paths to Literacy site to be very helpful. We tend to, because it says blind and visually impaired, a lot of people miss out going there because they think it's just for that population. And it was developed for them, but I think many of us can benefit from the Paths to Literacy materials. And they have sample materials then on experience books, story boxes, and walk you through how to create these. So what are the roles of team members then when we think about story boxes? I would hope that the general educator might inform us about the curriculum and materials that could be useful for us to put in a story box, and that we could integrate the story box for the included child into shared reading, or perhaps for all children in the classroom. The special educator, therapists, and parents play a role in creating these books, and it's awfully nice to do a duplicate for the family, and so that they can share it then across settings. And of course, we also play an important role in actually providing those literacy opportunities with the story boxes. Okay. So story boxes then in review can be about a lived experience, in which case they would be personalized literacy, but they may also be about a commercially produced book, in which case they are not personalized literacy, but still valuable. Experience books are always a type of personalized literacy. They are about the child's lived experiences, but that isn't enough. They also must be individually suitable for the child in terms of the representations we use for access and engagement. They are best if they are created with the child. So when it's objects, we hopefully collect them with the child, like maybe a candle from a birthday cake, but only if the child was attending during that time and found that interesting. If that was not the interest, then that would not be a good representation. So I have a couple of stories in my head about saliency, but I'll tell you one. I had a child who was deafblind come to my home. And of course, I knew her mother, and I was trying to put together some activities that I thought she would enjoy. But what she really did was different than what we had thought she would enjoy. She enjoyed plucking the straw from my broom while out on the deck. And she did that for quite a while, and that was fine. The other thing I'm a little embarrassed to tell you, and this is an old story, nobody has these little individual shaped soaps so much anymore because we have soap pumps. But at the time I had I guess an overly fragrant to her small soap. And when she used the bathroom, I guess the scent drew her in and she took a bite out of it. And that was a very negative but salient experience. So when that girl thinks about coming to Susan's house, the salient moments are my broom, the straw, and that soap. So of course, her mom and I had to have a page with the leftover soap and the bite of soap glued to a page, and we had to have some straw. And sometimes you do have to include things that represent a negative experience because that's part of the authentic memory for the child. And sometimes as educators and parents, we want to skirt by those things and not include them. But this is what I mean when I say saliency. How does the child define this? Not how do we define it? What did they touch? What did they express emotion over? What did they spend their most time with, like plucking the broom on the deck? We want to think about key vocabulary to feature in an experience book. And by the way, these experiences can be within the school setting. They can be an experience book about the playground. And experience books can be about something that's very everyday. Like if you're doing a cooking lesson that might be a few times a week, or it could be on a grooming activity. On the other hand, they can be about special events like a birthday or a holiday, but I don't want to mislead you into thinking that all experience books have to be about some exciting, dramatic, occasional experience, because that wouldn't be the case. We want to label them in print and in Braille if that's appropriate to the child's needs. And the reason that we're labeling in print isn't because we're planning on the child reading the print later necessarily. That might be true. The real reason we're doing it for pre-linguistic children is so that adults will read and say and sign the same things. So they're not making up a separate script, and then this confuses the child. Of course, they're going to ad lib a little bit with these experience books, but we still want some foundational script there for them. We can use pictures and line drawings for the children that can see those. And these personalized books then will trigger memories, and they will love these. One of the boys, I'm doing a longitudinal, he's a young man now, that I studied at 4 years, 8 years, and last year at 21. He wants to save all of those experience books from when he was very, very young. And he has no functional vision, but he still enjoys looking at those. And I think of that as kind of like looking through a photo album or something, you know, even though there'll be e-albums now, not paper albums, right? So we can also use these experience books in a really important way. Many children who have multiple disabilities, and absolutely all children who are congenitally deafblind, are going to struggle to achieve something we call distancing. And it's kind of complex. There's a lot of different elements to it. But one of the basic ideas I want to connect to is experience books allow us to reference and share something that has happened in another place and another time. And that's part of distancing, and development of distancing really undergirds the development of language then. You actually will not acquire language unless you process cognitively distancing in multiple ways. Over time, the child will increasingly assume more responsibility for the writing and the reading of the experience book. And remember that writing could be gluing a series of objects onto different pages to represent experiences that the child had in a particular setting or parts of a particular experience. We would want to store these eventually in a place that the child might be able to locate so they can invite you to share reading time with them. And then you'll know, oh, they want to revisit this memory then from before. All right, so here's a sample page. Sometimes objects, we notice the child's doing something that's very difficult to glue. Like in yesterday's presentation, I had a bag of dirt in the picture. So a child played in the dirt a lot in the backyard, and it's hard to glue dirt. And if you do, the whole textual quality of it is destroyed. So those of you that are in the fields of blindness or deaf blindness, this will be very familiar. Of course, you have to think about safety. We wouldn't want to do this if the child is likely to pick up some kernels of popcorn and stick them in an ear or up the nose or something. So it depends on the individual child, but you get the idea. And these don't have to be fancy. We don't have to take time to word process them. We can handwrite them and create them with the child. One thing that we should be careful about, though, is the glue. If the child has no visual impairment, then it's not a big deal so much. But if they are visually impaired and they're relying on touch to identify what these things are on the page, as soon as we glue it to the page, the fact that we have affixed it to the page means that the quality of it textually has changed. They're not able to feel all of the dimensions of it. So we want to be careful with the amount of glue and with the child's understanding of the object, if possible, before we affix it to the page. And that's why sometimes we don't fully affix it and we leave part of it loose for the child to be able to feel all sides of it. Here's a page from a child in one of my studies. They took a walk, and this is a page. The child sat on a rock. This one's a teenager who is deafblind and signs. So they wrote, we sat on a rock and took pictures. We walked some more and saw trees. And so they grabbed part of a tree. Now that will get old and gnarly over time. So they might have to repair it with the child, but that's okay. And then this book is about seasons, some more special events. And this particular child is deafblind, but she also has quite a bit of functional vision and isn't so affected by glare as many of the kids are. But you have to consider that. So now this one, in my opinion, has way too much glue on it, and you can see it, I know. So this one says, I celebrate my birthday, and they chose to use a candle, which would be good as long as the child looked at and touched the candle. I celebrate Easter, and they use part of an Easter egg then. And of course, these can be labeled in Braille too. And by the way, for the learners who are at a pre-Braille stage, it might be years of receptive experiences with Braille before they learn the meaning of a letter. I've seen that so many times with kids who are deafblind. 4 or 5 years might go by, and then that symbolic quality clicks cognitively, and then they move very rapidly in their linguistic development. So this one here is a sample page from a COVID experience book. And a lot of teachers worked really hard to get kids to wear masks, and I'm sure some of you are among them. So this one is Tanya wore a mask, but they didn't want to do a whole book about just masks. That would probably be pretty negative, and she wouldn't want to share it. And so they moved on then to include other pages of her activities then. That was just part of a book. And again, you can go to Paths to Literacy for information about tactile experience books. All right, so like we did with story boxes, let's think about implementing them. So we want to have the experience books be more than a read aloud. We do not want it to be a passive experience for the child. And we set the stage for it to be interactive by hopefully having a shared experience with the child and by creating the experience book with the child. So we want to create turn-taking opportunities, not just opportunities to answer questions. Excuse me. We want to consider a little bit of pre-teaching and reviewing perhaps pre-teaching vocabulary. We want to take our time. The learner needs to look and touch the representations on each page, and we want to give them time to cognitively process it, to think about its connection then to an experience they had. And in the beginning, the sharing of these experience books is most powerful if they're shared between the child with disability and the person who shared the actual experience with them, because they have a shared memory, right? So take our time. We will have labels and narrative on the page, sometimes very little, sometimes a little more, depending on the child. And this will ensure then, as I said before, that adults will say and sign the same things. And we will create opportunities for the child to do this as well. We can also work on book handling skills, hopefully not ripping the representations off the page, top and bottom, left to right, turning the page. And then communication skills like vocabulary, like taking turns in a conversation, and so on. So what are the roles of the team members when it comes to experience books? A general educator might share a key event that's coming up in the inclusive setting. It might become an entire experience book, or maybe a page in a book about experiences in room 12. And we can attend to key vocabulary that are important to the child we're focused on, but maybe to the other children as well. Key to that experience. And then the special educator, the therapists, and the parents can co-create pages with the child, and they can share reading across environments. This slide might look a little strange at first glance, saying components of self-determination up 2/3 of the way or so through a talk on literacy. So what the heck am I thinking about? So I got to tell you, I get a little upset sometimes when I see what we do with choice making. I'm going to be really blunt with you and say I know we fake it a lot. And parents pick up on that just like this. If we say their child made a choice, sometimes they don't believe us because they've never seen it happen, or they know the child would not have made that choice, or for some other reason. So choice making is one of the components of self-determination. And because I think it's so important to be very thoughtful and respectful of the children when we engage in choice-making opportunities, coupled with the fact that it has some elements of literacy, I decided to call it a classic literacy lesson and put it on the list. So you may disagree, and that's perfectly fine, but I confess. So the components of self-determination are self-awareness, self-regulation, problem solving, goal setting and attainment, choice making, which is differentiated from decision making, self-efficacy, a sense of, yeah, I did it. Aren't I good at that? And self-advocacy. And self-advocacy, as the child advances in their just development and as they mature, includes advocacy for any group of which they are a member. So it includes political advocacy and group advocacy as well, which can, of course, intertwine. So in a study by Eric Carter and others, and he's very well known in special ed, they asked parents to rate which of the areas of self-determination they were most concerned about, they most wanted their children to master. And these are the three they said. They wanted them to have strong knowledge about themselves. That makes sense. And then choice making was one of the three, and problem solving is the third. So we care about this because we want to be respectful to learners. We recognize that being able to express your preferences, your likes and your dislikes, and to reject things you don't want is important to our personhood, isn't it? So I've called this a literacy lesson to draw attention to it, largely, to be really honest about it. It is a lesson that involves representations, whether they're actual objects, whether they're photographs, or whether they are symbols. It involves listening. It often involves the sequencing of objects, either two things that are presented at once, or a sequence of selections or options that are presented one at a time. Communication then undergirds choice making, and choice making empowers and also builds communication skills. And to some degree, I think relationships, because we're showing we care about what they care about. We care about their opinion. And that's why it's so important for it to be respectful. So choice making can be embedded all through the day, like when constructing daily schedules. Kids don't get to choose what they do through the whole day, but maybe they can make a choice within the day, or maybe 1 or 2 days of the week. Or maybe they could choose who they worked with while they do a particular activity. That would be fun. They make choices for what goes in story boxes or experience books. And you'll think of many other choice-making opportunities, like selecting food in the cafeteria line, for example. So let's talk about choice-making vocabulary. so we're all on the same page. So what we offer are the options. So, oh, I wish I gathered a couple of good objects. I usually do, and I forgot. But say I held up a watch and a staple, which would probably be horribly boring to the kids and maybe not a good idea at all, but just for illustrating. These two things then are the options, okay? If we're making choices at an object level, which is where we want to begin, whether the child's blind or not. The representation would be the icon or the symbol we use to represent a watch and the staple. So that could be a photograph, which is very iconic because it looks like what it represents, the watch or the stapler, or it could be a symbol like a line drawing that's more abstract. Line drawings can be iconic or they can be some symbolic. They're a mix, but in general, they're more complex to understand than objects. Or we may simply, again, use the actual objects. The next term is a selection response or an indicating response. So this is how the child will make the selection of the preferred option. Will they simply take it? Will they point to it? Will they touch it? Will they perhaps look at it? Will their breathing change when they see or touch their preferred option? So that's individual to the child. All right, so here's the big one. Let's make choice making authentic, meaning that the child really is selecting preferences and not selecting non-preferred. And I know for a while, the child may have distinct preferences and still choose something else because they don't yet quite understand the choice-making procedure that you're using with them. And they will get that over time. But I'll tell you what really bothers me about it, and that's what I put on this slide. So the first thing is, if you're going to offer options, make sure the child, again, has the experiences to ground understanding of the object. So I know very little about cars. So if you pulled something out from under my hood, which I have very seldom visited, or maybe two things, and offered me a choice, oh gee, I probably wouldn't make any choice, but if I did, it would not be authentic because I would have no preference for either one. And I don't have enough experience to even know what they are. So it's meaningless. It's not authentic. And even though you think I perhaps should know more about the car I drive, it actually is kind of disrespectful when you think about it. So experiences ground understanding. So they have to have the experience. Don't put something foreign to them up as a selection then or an option. We need to know the representations for those options. So this is not the time to hold up two line drawings when you have no evidence that the child comprehends the meaning of any line drawing. We do not teach the meaning of print, braille, line drawings, or even photographs in the context of choice making. And that's the one that really bothers me. And teachers sometimes observe related service professionals doing that, and they just shake their head and said, well, she said he selected X, but I know he doesn't know either one of those line drawings. So that just didn't happen at all. And that's what I mean when I say faking it. And that happens all the time. So I'm hoping we can all be little missionaries about this and say, hey, why don't we make sure that we have representations that the child already understands? Now, having said that, for the kids that are the most involved, it is possible they don't understand the objects yet, but that's as concrete as we'll be able to make it, and maybe incorporate a little movement with the objects. So that's really, really important. We also want to make sure, especially in those early choice-making opportunities, that we offer options of different value, like something that they really, really like and something that they really dislike. That's one of the quickest ways to teach them the whole choice-making procedure, because they're going to select what they don't really like, and they're going to have it for a certain number of seconds before you give them another opportunity, and they're not going to be happy about it. And that's difficult because if they're having trouble with that, they may not have the concept of same and different so that you can then introduce it, but you're still going to use that and you'll give them another opportunity. But for a brief time, they live with the selection that they made, the option that they selected. And then we need an indicating or selection response that is efficient for that child. And there's so many other things for us to concern ourselves, like where do we present the option in the child's visual field? Being consistent with our receptive vocabulary. As I said, the child gets what they selected. Please don't rescue them immediately. Also, we've got to avoid giving them cues. I have so many films that make me smile because I know people are so well-meaning, but they lean forward with the option they know the child really likes to help them out, or they wiggle that one dramatically and then the next one not at all. Or, you know, the one on the right gets wiggled and the one on the left is like faded back. All sorts of funny things that we do that really aren't so funny when you think about it, because we're trying to help them cheat really and get the answer we think they will make. And we shouldn't be so presumptuous. Let them have the integrity of making their own selection then. All right. And of course, systematic preference assessment can help you with some of this. And I should also tell you one thing that's counterintuitive. And I really identify with this as a parent, and it really helps me with any assumptions I might have. We actually have some research evidence that children with more extensive support needs, although they may hold on to some preferences for a very long time, like, you know, the story of Elmo being deeply loved by a 20-year-old, and I'm not making a judgment about that. But it's also true they can be very context connected in their preferences. And maybe there's some beauty to that, that what they like is connected to us because we're interacting with them, we're touching them. The relationship is different than it often is between a teacher and a child, or even a parent and a child without disabilities. So sometimes they will have different preferences in different settings. And that doesn't mean that it isn't a real preference. It may be a preference when they're with so-and-so. So my own daughter, who acquired complex disabilities over time, someone who was a caregiver for her in adulthood told me she loved Taco Bell. And for a while, I didn't believe it because she never once asked me for that. I was more the one that had to take her out for crab legs. But when I think about it, she finds it enormously funny that I'll crack the crab legs with all the patience in the world, and the mess afterwards kind of seems funny to her. So I kind of accepted over time that it was really about the interaction effect, perhaps, that made something a preference with one person and not another. But still, we have to be careful about that and not be surrogates and respect what they really prefer.
Let's spend a couple minutes thinking about how we should present choice-making opportunities. As I said a few minutes ago, the size of the array is important. And then we must think about how we want to present the various options we have selected. So if we think that it's correct to offer a selection from two options, we have to decide if we're going to present them one at a time with a pause between each, being very careful about where we present the child's visual field, or if we will present these two options in a pair. And if we do that, we then must decide if we're going to offer them side by side and how much space between, again, thinking about the child's visual field, or will we present the pair one above the other, so a top and a bottom option. Again, visual field is an important consideration. We must also think deeply about the vocabulary we will use when offering choice-making opportunities, including the vocabulary we will use if the child appears to have made an error in their selection. We don't want to be overly wordy, and this is important because we want the child to hear the same language if the child has functional hearing, or the child to see the same signs or whatever representations we may be using for the communication portion of this. We must decide then how long to present each option and be consistent. Oftentimes in schools, we do observe adults showing what they think the child will prefer for a longer period of time. And oh my goodness, those other choices or other options are put up quickly and then they disappear. We should not do that. We need to be consistent and present each option, each of their selections, we could say, for an equal amount of time. We must decide, if we're presenting one option at a time, how long to pause between options. It is really important that we do not leak clues or try to exert our influence over the child's opportunity to make an authentic selection. I understand that this is tempting because we want the kids to be happy, and we do often know their preferences and what they would want to select. And we might be concerned that they're not paying attention when they're making a selection. But the way to address those issues is not through leaking clues. And when you really think about it, it's kind of disrespectful, isn't it? If we believe that they can make an authentic choice, or perhaps they're not always able to do that yet, but we're working on that skill, then we really can't be leaking clues and overpowering them, or we violate the principles that really ground self-determination. And one of the ways we also help the child to understand their power in making a selection is by ensuring this last bulleted item. And that is that the child must get what he or she selects. So if the child doesn't seem happy with it, the child sticks with it for whatever length of time you think is appropriate. I'm not suggesting a long length of time here, but think about the child's age, the child's behavioral characteristics, and so forth. And then you may choose to re-offer the selections and see if the child then makes a different selection. And often what we see is once they stick with something they really didn't mean to select, they will often pay more attention when it's re-offered the next time.
Okay, so that was a little review. I slipped in some of those ideas a little earlier. And then I think I have just a couple of pages here of references of different articles, and some of these are studies, some of these are more conceptual pieces. The ones about with Kolbe's name in them show the growth from when he was 4 years to 8 years of age. And here's some additional references, including a summary of evidence-based practices that was done for the Cedar Center with the Farrell et al. Study. And then Luckner, who's in the field of deaf education, and I and Kay Farrell did an article also on evidence-based practices in literacy. But that would be literacy more broadly, not only focused on emergent literacy. Mackenzie is well known for her work in thinking about learning in literacy environments. And I mentioned Wood and others in terms of self-determination. So let me stop sharing that screen because we've completed our work on the PowerPoint. And Jen, I don't know if you want to help me, or maybe I'll just go into
Susan,
the chat room.
this is Anna, and there is one question in the chat.
Okay, let me scroll through here to make sure. Oh, a lot of these are about the certificate. Let me scroll. and
At the
see.
very bottom, there's one about, I'll read it to you. It says, what verbiage should teachers be using with those children or students who are at the foundational level? Should we use simple phrases or one-word labels, question mark?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We were just talking about that yesterday in a team meeting that I was part of. So I think it's okay to have short phrases or even single words that you're going to say and sign to the child. So there might be very low vocabulary demands, a smaller number of words, or even a single word when the child is at that very beginning level of understanding, and then you will expand it over time. And I don't think we have to be so strict that everybody has to say exactly the same thing when they're sharing a story box or an experience book. But by labeling, we ensure that at least those key vocabulary items are shared with the child and practiced. And then if people expand and make additional comments, no great sin, that will be fine too. And I will send the slides out. We'll make sure you get them. I see that question.
Thank you, Susan, so much. Do we have a few minutes if there are any other questions for Susan? You can ask, you can unmute yourself, or you can drop it in the chat and I can share it.
I want to thank Clint, our excellent interpreter. Thank you.